Hey guys, I'm Andrea Dunlop, and this is part 5 in my series on sensitivity readers. So far I've covered what a sensitivity reader is and when you might need one. I've talked about kind of the two sides of the arguments around sensitivity readers, and I got into some case studies last week talking about a birthday cake for George Washington and When We Was Fierce. So now those were the only two books that came up a lot that I could find that were actually pulled from the shelves by the publisher and by the author respectively. So the fates of the two I'm going to talk about today were a little different. We'll get into that. And again, we find ourselves in the YA realm where the majority of this conversation has taken place. Okay, so again, I'm going through these books to kind of recap the discussion that happened and kind of see what our takeaways around this issue can be. So another one that came up a lot was American Heart. So this was a 2018 release from Harper Teen by author Laura Moriarty, who is white. So this was a YA novel about a 15-year-old girl called Sarah Mary, who's born in Missouri, in a future America where Muslim Americans are detained in camps. Sarah Mary supports the camps until she runs into a Muslim woman, Sadaf, who is a fugitive, and helps her escape to Canada. The experience helps Sarah Mary realize that maybe the idea of the camps is wrong. So this is our first case where the author actually did use two sensitivity readers pre-publication. This book, like all of these cases, got a lot of early hype, including a starred review in Kirkus that was written by a Muslim American writer. And I mention that because we're going to come back to the Kirkus question later. So there was immediate backlash from readers once this book started circulating more widely pre-publication. The biggest thing here being the pretty obvious white savior trope that the book relies on. So there's a great review from Celeste Pewter that I'm going to link to in my blog that I encourage you to read, but I'm going to quote actually just directly from it here. So Celeste says, "It's impossible to escape the conclusion that Sarah Mary's journey is anything but a Bildungsroman," I can never say that word right, that uses the genuine fears of the Muslim American community as a mechanism for Sarah Mary to grow. It's Sarah Mary's journey, first and foremost, with Sadaf and the actual Muslim American community's challenge and concerns coming in a firm second. Bottom line, Pewter says, this is an example of an author telling a story that they were ill-equipped to tell, both intellectually and narratively. It's worth mentioning, of course, that around this time, our actual president was talking about Muslim registry. And of course, the United States has a very ugly history with interning its own citizens. So the nerves that this story was touching on are very, very real. So in response to the backlash, Kirkus ended up amending its review and pulling its star. And that kind of brought the online conversation just to a full firestorm. So the author had many defenders who leapt in and compared Kirkus's actions to, you guessed it, censorship. And the author made things infinitely worse by going in and publicly cheering her defenders on. And as far as I can tell, she made no attempt to sort of meaningfully address the criticisms of her book or the concerns of this community. So I'm going to do a future video on whether or not an author should ever weigh in to kind of these online debates that happen around books, and when is kind of an appropriate time to speak out. You know, needless to say, it's never a good look when you're coming out and getting defensive and starting to call censorship on things that are just in no plausible definition of the word censorship. So, you know, the big takeaway here is, I think, you know, something that I brought up a couple times talking about sensitivity readers. You know, using sensitivity readers is not an insurance policy that your book will not be criticized or that you haven't missed the mark. This is not a free pass. So don't try and trot out the fact that you use sensitivity readers if people are criticizing your book. You don't get to sort of throw them under the bus. So Kirkus's response to this whole thing was a bit muddled, I thought, reading through it. I linked to it on my blog. I don't want to get too much in the weeds to it here, but nonetheless, them amending a review is not censorship. It's just them making a business decision based on what they think will be best for their reputation and their position as an authority in the book world. Okay, next up, we've got a book called The Continent. So this was originally scheduled for a 2017 release. The author here is Kira Drake. And this was coming out from Harlequin. So the hype for this book started, as it frequently does in these conversations, with Drake, a first-time author, getting a really big advance. So Publishers Weekly, which is our main trade publication in the book world, reported that she got a significant advance for her 3-book deal. Now, significant is code for between $250,000 and $500,000. So they use this coded system. I talked about this in my Publishing Paid Me episode about sort of all of the obscurity around advances, but that's obviously a separate conversation. So this book was, again, YA, and it's a sci-fi book about a 16-year-old girl who goes on a helicopter tour of a place called the Continent, where 2 uncivilized tribes are locked in perpetual war. So her copter crashes and she's rescued by one of the natives, and she goes on to save his people from ruin. So early readers were horrified by the depictions of the 2, quote, uncivilized tribes, which seem to be coded very heavily as Native American on the one hand and Asian on the other. The tribe called the Topi, which is 1 letter off from Hopi, which is obviously a real Native American tribe, was described as having reddish-brown skin, smearing their faces with war paint, and savagely attacking people with arrows. The other tribe was described as having ninja-like skills and our old favorite almond-shaped eyes. You get the picture. So worth mentioning here with the identity of the author, Drake is white. She's in her mid-40s and she lives in Salt Lake City. She is reportedly completely unaware of the conversation around diversity in publishing. And so when she saw the early criticism for the book, she was very dismayed and asked her publisher if she could actually delay the publication to give her some more time to work on the book. So in the meantime, you know, this criticism was really coming to a head. Her husband went on a really unfortunate Twitter rant and called Justina Ireland, who'd done a kind of early review of the book or breakdown of the book on Twitter, called her a bigoted troll. Drake and her husband are now separated. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. The eventual revision appears to have, so she took the book off the market. She did some revisions, reportedly worked with a couple of sensitivity readers, and but the eventual revision appears to have only addressed minor issues, such as calling the, quote, savage tribe the Zo instead of the Topi, removing the war paint, descriptions of almond-shaped eyes, that kind of thing, and making the protagonist slightly more ethnically ambiguous rather than having her be clearly coded white. Okay, so there was a great piece in Vulture written by Layla Shapiro about this whole mishegas, and I want to read just a graph from that to give you kind of an idea of what happened. She interviewed a bunch of the major players in this scandal. So Shapiro says, Drake told me that she took heart from the fact that her sensitivity readers loved the revision and just suggested a few minor tweaks. But when I spoke to one of the 2 sensitivity readers Harlequin had hired, she recalled sending suggestions for an extensive rewrite to Wilson, the editor, who was reluctant to pass them on to Drake, according to the reader. Wilson said that she felt they'd already put Drake through the ringer and that another page 1 revision would be too onerous. Publishers often cite hiring of sensitivity readers as proof that they've done due diligence, but they pay as little as $250 per read, and they're always free to ignore the sensitivity reader's suggestions. Once the reader sends in the notes, they have no control over whether or how that advice is put to use. So you've heard me say things along those lines a couple of times, and I'm going to keep repeating it. This is all a question of power and who has kind of the final say. So I really wanted to give this author credit for trying here, but yikes, it just sounds like she, was not really willing to do the work here. So, my conclusion for this one and kind of our takeaway from this one is that sensitivity readers only work and only contribute to a manuscript if you actually listen to them. And I have to say, like, an adult author who starts out being completely unaware of the issues around diversity in publishing probably does not have the range to pull off a story like this. And if anyone could have salvaged this book at all, it probably probably was not this author. I also wanted to just mention as an end note here that Justina Ireland received death threats for her criticism of this book, and people calling her work suggesting that they fire her. So I think it's really worth questioning who is actually being bullied here. Okay, so to just kind of wrap up these 4 big examples, they're certainly not the only books that this has happened with, but because these 4 kept coming up again and again, I wanted to dig into them. You know, these books were held up again and again as examples of censorship and kind of wokeness run amok, but these are books that probably just should never have seen the light of day in the first place, at least without a lot more work. And it's worth reiterating that only one of these 4 books was actually pulled by the publisher. So, you know, I encourage you, if you're interested, go to my blog, read all those links, read up on these books a little bit yourself, and decide for yourself whether or not you think this is a case of overreaction of any kind. And I think it's worth mentioning, just to kind of close this part of the conversation, that of course, this outrage is not just about these books when it comes up. It's about an industry that continues to value white authors and sometimes racist books over, you know, own voices, work, and work that is coming from marginalized communities. Okay, so as I mentioned, you know, most of these scandals have happened in the YA space, where I think this conversation is just at a different tenor because, again, you're dealing with ostensibly a more impressionable audience, though of course a lot of adults do read YA, but the adult fiction world got a huge one of its own this year. So next time, it's time to get dirty, American dirty. I'm so sorry.